One cold morning, Jack Mason, a retired park ranger, stumbles upon a horrifying sight in the middle of a blizzard. A wounded mother bear lies motionless in the snow, with her 3 tiny cubs struggling to survive. The chances of survival seem almost impossible for this bear family. But what happens when Jack decides he won't give up? The signs of cruelty behind the mother bear's injuries reveal a dark secret. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Jack Mason pulled his thick wool scarf tighter around his weathered face, squinting against the biting wind that tore through the dense forest. At 63, the retired park ranger had seen his share of brutal Montana winters. But this storm was different. The Weather Service had warned of a record-breaking blizzard, and now as he struggled to check his property's perimeter, he understood why. His small cabin, nestled against the backdrop of towering pines, was barely visible through the curtain of snow. Jack had spent 30 years protecting these forests and their wildlife, and even in retirement, he couldn't shake the habit of patrolling during storms, checking for downed trees or animals in distress. The wind suddenly shifted, carrying with it a sound that made Jack freeze in his tracks. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about that sound, weak and desperate, triggered every protective impulse he possessed. He turned slowly, straining to locate its source. There, through the white-out conditions, he caught a glimpse of something dark against the snow. Jack moved carefully, his hand instinctively reaching for the tranquilizer gun he still carried during his walks, a habit from his ranger days. As he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. The massive form of a female grizzly bear lay partially buried in the growing snowdrift. Her size was impressive, even in her current state, but it was the 3 tiny forms huddled against her that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. Cubs, so young their eyes had likely only been open for days, were trying desperately to nurse from their mother. "Oh God," Jack whispered, his voice trembling. The mother bear's breathing was shallow, her body temperature dropping dangerously low. A wound in her shoulder, likely from a bullet, told a story Jack had seen too many times before. Poachers, operating under the cover of the storm. The cubs were failing. Their tiny bodies, not yet equipped to handle the brutal Montana winter, trembled violently. One of them lifted its head weakly, letting out a cry that pierced Jack's heart. He knew the odds. Newborn cubs had virtually no chance of survival without their mother, and even with her, in these conditions, Jack keyed the radio attached to his jacket, his fingers numb as he pressed the button. "Rachel, are you there?" "It's Jack. I've got an emergency." Static crackled before a woman's voice responded. Rachel Thompson, the local wildlife veterinarian, had been his partner in countless rescues during his ranger days. "What's wrong, Jack?" "Female grizzly down. 3 cubs, all critical. About half a mile east of my cabin. Gunshot wound, hypothermia setting in fast. Need immediate assistance." "Jack, the roads are completely snowed in. I can't." "They won't survive the night, Rachel." His voice cracked with emotion. "These cubs, they're no more than 3 weeks old." There was a long pause before Rachel's voice returned, stronger now. "Okay, listen carefully. You'll have to bring them in yourself. I'll talk you through it, but Jack, you have to be extremely careful. Even wounded, a mother bear." "I know the risks," he interrupted, already shrugging off his heavy coat. "But I won't let them die out here, not like this." The mother bear's eyes fluttered open as Jack approached, and in that moment, something passed between them. Her gaze, though clouded with pain, held no aggression. Instead, there was something else. A recognition, perhaps, or a desperate plea. Jack had spent his life learning to read wild animals. But this was different. This was a mother, knowing her time was short, seeing perhaps her cub's only chance at survival. "I'll take care of them," Jack promised softly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "You have my word." As he carefully began to assess the situation, the smallest cub, weak but determined, reached out a tiny paw and touched Jack's hand. The gesture, so innocent and trusting, cemented his resolve. Whatever it took, he would not let these cubs become another tragic statistic in the ongoing battle between wildlife and human cruelty. The blizzard intensified around them, But Jack barely noticed the cold anymore. He was already formulating a plan, knowing that the next few hours would determine not only the cub's fate, but also whether their mother's last act of trusting humanity would be rewarded or betrayed. Through the howling wind and swirling snow, Jack trudged back to his cabin. The 3 bear cubs nestled inside his thick winter coat. Their tiny bodies trembled against his chest, their weak cries barely audible above the storm. Behind him, for local men he'd managed to contact, struggled with a makeshift stretcher, carrying the mother bear, her massive form a dark shadow in the whiteout conditions. Rachel's voice crackled through the radio, guiding them through the treacherous journey. "How's her breathing, Jack?" The concern in her voice was palpable, even through the static. "Shallow but steady," he responded, adjusting his grip on the precious cargo against his chest. "Cubs are losing body heat fast, though. The smallest one." He couldn't finish the sentence, his throat tightening as the tiny cub in question let out a particularly weak whimper. Finally, the warm glow of his cabin windows pierced through the white curtain of snow. Jack had already prepared the space, clearing his living room and laying down thick blankets near the roaring fireplace. As they carefully maneuvered the mother bear inside, Jack quickly assessed her condition under the bright indoor light. Her fur was matted with blood and ice, the gunshot wound in her shoulder now clearly visible. But it was the tracking collar around her neck that caught Jack's attention. "She's one of ours," he breathed, recognizing the Department of Wildlife Conservation's markings. His fingers traced the identification number embossed on the metal. "Lund 274, Bella." Rachel's voice came through the radio again. "She was part of our breeding program study. Remarkable bear. She successfully raised 2 sets of cubs before these ones." The pride in Rachel's voice quickly gave way to anger. "Someone shot a collar bear, Jack. This wasn't just poaching. This was deliberate." Jack gently placed the cubs next to their mother, watching as they immediately burrowed against her fur, seeking warmth and comfort. The largest cub, his fur a rich chocolate brown, positioned himself protectively in front of his siblings. The middle cub, slightly lighter in color, kept nudging his mother's face with his tiny snout. The smallest one, with a distinctive white patch on his chest, barely moved at all. Working quickly, Jack and his volunteers began emergency care, following Rachel's instructions. They cleaned Bella's wound, applied pressure bandages, and set up heating pads around the bears. The cubs needed to be fed, but without proper formula, they had to improvise with a mixture Rachel helped them prepare using supplies from Jack's kitchen. Hours passed in a blur of activity. The local men left once the immediate crisis had stabilized, promising to return with supplies when the storm broke. Jack remained vigilant, monitoring Bella's breathing and helping the cubs nurse when they showed interest. The smallest cub proved to be the most challenging, refusing to eat until Jack gently massaged his throat, encouraging him to swallow. As the night deepened, Jack found himself talking softly to the bears, a habit from his ranger days. "You're safe now, Bella," he murmured, carefully checking her bandages. "Your cubs are fighters, just like their mama." Bella's eyes flickered open briefly, meeting Jack's gaze with that same trust he'd seen in the forest. The tracking collar's presence weighed heavily on Jack's mind. He knew these bears, had possibly even encountered Bella before during his ranger days. The breeding program was crucial for maintaining healthy grizzly populations in Montana, and Bella had been one of their success stories. The thought that someone had deliberately targeted her made his blood boil. Near midnight, the radio crackled again. "Jack?" Rachel's voice was thick with exhaustion. "How are they doing?" "Bella's holding steady," he reported, watching as the mother bear took shallow but regular breaths. "The 2 larger cubs are showing good signs. They're nursing when they can, moving around a bit. The little one," he paused, looking at the smallest cub still barely moving. "I'm worried about him, Rachel. Keep him warm. Keep trying with the formula. I've got a team assembling emergency supplies, but this storm..." She didn't need to finish. They both knew help wouldn't arrive until morning at the earliest. Jack settled into his armchair, positioned where he could watch all 4 bears. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the wind's howl had diminished to a low moan. In the relative quiet, he could hear the cubs' soft whimpers and their mother's labored breathing. His mind wandered to the countless rescues he'd performed during his career, but this felt different. Perhaps it was Bella's obvious intelligence and trust, or the way the cubs had already begun showing distinct personalities despite their desperate situation. The largest one was clearly protective, the middle cub devoted to his mother, and the smallest. Well, Jack was already calling him Thor in his head, impressed by the tiny cub's determination to survive despite his weakness. As if hearing his thoughts, Thor lifted his head slightly, letting out a small sound that might have been a cry or a greeting. Jack reached out slowly, letting the cub sniff his fingers. To his surprise, the tiny bear grabbed his index finger with both paws, holding on with surprising strength. "That's it, little one," Jack encouraged softly, careful not to disturb the others. "You hold on, help's coming." The cub's grip remained firm, even as he drifted back to sleep, and Jack didn't have the heart to pull away. Instead, he sat there, his finger trapped in the tiny bear's grasp, watching as the night slowly gave way to dawn. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the Montana wilderness. But inside Jack's cabin, a small miracle was unfolding, one built on trust, compassion, and the unshakable instinct to protect those in need, regardless of species. The first rays of dawn crept through Jack's frosted windows, casting a pale golden glow over the bears. During the night, he had carefully removed Bella's tracking collar to make her more comfortable. And now in the morning light, he examined it closely. The device was sophisticated, equipped with not just GPS, but also data storage capabilities. Years of ranger experience told in this collar might hold vital clues about what had happened to Bella. Rachel arrived just after sunrise, her four-wheel drive somehow managing the treacherous roads. She burst through the door in a flurry of snow and determination, her medical kit clutched tightly against her chest. The sight of Bella and her cub stopped her in her tracks. "Oh, Jack," she breathed, kneeling beside the bears. "You did it. You actually did it." Her practice hands began examining Bella's wound, while Jack brought her up to speed on the night's events. The cub stirred at her presence, but didn't show any signs of distress. "The collar," Jack said, handing it to Rachel. "Can you access its data? Might tell us who did this." Rachel connected the collar to her laptop, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she read through the data. "Bella's movements over the past month show she was being tracked," she said finally, turning the screen so Jack could see. "Look at these patterns. Someone was deliberately following her, waiting for the right moment. Poachers." Worse, Rachel's voice hardened. "These are professional patterns. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, knew about the collar, knew her habits. This wasn't random, as if understanding they were discussing her." Bella lifted her head slightly, her eyes finding Jack's. The largest cub, who they'd started calling Zeus, immediately moved closer to his mother, while the middle cub, now nicknamed Cooper for his habit of mimicking his mother's movements, watched Rachel intently. Thor, the smallest, remained curled against Bella's side, but his eyes were bright and alert. "The cubs are showing remarkable resilience," Rachel noted, carefully examining each one. "Zeus here is already displaying protective behaviors typical of older cubs. Cooper seems to have strong maternal bonding instincts. And Thor?" She smiled as the tiny cub grabbed her finger, just as he had done with Jack. "Well, he's certainly living up to his name." Jack shared his observations from the night, and together they developed a care plan. Bella's wound was severe but not immediately life-threatening. The bigger concern was infection and her ability to care for the cubs while recovering. They would need round-the-clock care, specialized formula, and eventually a plan for rehabilitation. As Rachel worked, Jack made some calls to his old contacts in wildlife law enforcement. The data from Bella's collar was damning. It clearly showed a pattern of professional tracking, suggesting an organized operation targeting research bears. The implications were disturbing. These weren't simple poachers. This was something more sinister. "Jack," Rachel called him over, her voice urgent. "Look at this." She pointed to her screen, where Bella's tracking data revealed something they had missed. These coordinates, the pattern of movement. She was being herded away from protected areas, pushed into zones where hunting is permitted. They were trying to make it look legal. The revelation hit Jack hard. He looked at Bella, remembering all the bears he'd helped protect during his career, all the progress they'd made in conservation efforts. The thought that someone would deliberately target research bears, potentially undermining years of work, filled him with cold anger. A soft whimper drew his attention back to the cubs. Fighter had managed to crawl a short distance, his tiny legs wobbling with effort. Zeus immediately moved to support his smaller brother, while Cooper watched attentively, ready to help if needed. The sight of their cooperation, their instinctive care for each other, strengthened Jack's resolve. "We need to document everything," he said, reaching for his camera. "These cubs aren't just survivors now, they're evidence, proof of what these people are willing to do." Rachel nodded, understanding the implications. "I'll contact the research team. We'll need to monitor all our collared bears more closely." "But Jack?" She hesitated, glancing at Bella and her cubs. "What about them? They can't stay here indefinitely." "One step at a time," Jack replied, watching as Fighter finally reached his destination, a patch of sunlight streaming through the window. "Right now, they need us. The rest?" He trailed off as Bella made a soft, huffing sound, drawing her cubs back to her side with gentle nudges. "The rest we'll figure out together." The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the scene in Jack's cabin. A wounded mother bear, 3 tiny cubs fighting for survival, and 2 humans dedicated to protecting them. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine snow and crystal-clear skies. But inside, an even more remarkable transformation was taking place, one of healing, trust, and the unshakable determination to right a terrible wrong. The next few days brought both progress and setbacks in Bella's recovery. Rachel had established a makeshift veterinary station in Jack's cabin, transforming his rustic living room into an emergency wildlife care unit. Bella's wounds showed signs of infection, despite their best efforts, her strength wavering as she fought to stay alive for her cubs. Zeus, the largest cub, had taken to following Jack whenever he moved around the cabin, his tiny form casting a comical shadow as he wobbled after the retired ranger. Cooper remained ever vigilant near his mother, while Thor, though still the smallest, grew stronger each day, his determination earning him admiring glances from both humans. "Her fever's rising again," Rachel announced one evening, checking Bella's temperature. The mother bear's breathing had become more labored, her massive body trembling with effort. "We need stronger antibiotics, Jack. The ones we're using aren't cutting it." Jack watched as Thor attempted to nurse, Bella weakly shifting to accommodate her smallest cub. "Make the calls," he said grimly. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. These cubs aren't losing their mother." News of Bella and her cubs had spread through the local wildlife community. Retired rangers, conservationists, and even some of Jack's old colleagues began showing up at his cabin, offering help, supplies, and expertise. A local veterinary supply company donated critical medications, while a wildlife rehabilitation center sent specialized formula for the cubs. One particularly challenging night, as Bella's fever peaked, Jack sat beside her, talking softly as he had done since the rescue. "You're the strongest bear I've ever encountered," he murmured, applying cool compresses to her neck. "Those cubs need you, Bella. We all need you." As if understanding, Bella's eyes opened, meeting Jack's gaze with that same intelligent look he'd seen in the forest. She made a soft, huffing sound, and all 3 cubs immediately responded, pressing closer to her. The display of maternal bond, even in her weakened state, brought tears to Jack's eyes. Rachel, who had been analyzing more data from Bella's collar, looked up from her laptop. "Jack, come see this." Her voice held a mix of excitement and concern. Bella's data shows she was part of a larger study on maternal behavior in grizzlies. Her success with previous cubs made her incredibly valuable to research. Someone knew exactly what they were targeting. The implications were staggering. Bella wasn't just any bear. She was a key subject in understanding how grizzly mothers taught survival skills to their cubs. Her experience and instincts were irreplaceable, not just for her current cubs, but for the entire species' conservation efforts. Thor chose that moment to demonstrate his growing strength, successfully climbing onto Jack's lap unassisted. The tiny cub had developed a special bond with his rescuer, often seeking him out for comfort when not nursing. Zeus, ever protective, watched the interaction carefully from his position near Bella's head, while Cooper maintained his usual closeness to their mother. "Look at their personalities developing," Rachel marveled, momentarily distracted from her research. Zeus's protective instincts shadowed devotion to Bella, Thor's resilience. They're already showing traits that will help them survive in the wild. Jack gently stroked Thor's head, earning a contented grunt from the cub. "If we can get Bella through this," he said, "these cubs have a real chance. She's their best hope for learning everything they need to know." Days blended into nights as they fought to save Bella. The infection raged through her body, but her will to live remained strong. Jack and Rachel worked in shifts, ensuring someone was always awake to monitor her condition and care for the cubs. The local wildlife community continued their support, creating a network of care that surrounded the little family. One morning, as Jack changed Bella's bandages, he noticed something different in her eyes. The fever-induced haze had lifted, replaced by clear, focused awareness. Her breathing, while still labored, had a stronger rhythm. Rachel confirmed what they had hoped. Bella was turning a corner. "She's fighting back," Rachel announced, relief evident in her voice. "The antibiotics are finally working." "But Jack," she hesitated, "she's still got a long way to go. And these cubs, they're growing fast. We need to start thinking about the next phase." Jack watched as Zeus attempted to show his siblings how to stand on their hind legs, a comical sight that ended with all three cubs tumbling over each other. Bella observed her offspring with apparent pride, occasionally offering gentle corrections with soft vocalizations. "One day at a time," Jack replied, his voice firm. "Right now, they need their mother's guidance more than anything. Everything else can wait." As if to emphasize his point, Thor suddenly abandoned his play session and climbed into Jack's lap again, his favorite spot when not with Bella. Zeus and Cooper followed, creating a warm pile of fur that made both humans smile despite their concerns. Bella watched the interaction with what seemed like approval, her eyes meeting Jack's once again. In that moment, he understood that while they had saved her life, she was now teaching them something equally valuable: the power of family, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that form in the face of adversity. The setting sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows, painting the scene in warm hues of gold and amber. Outside, the Montana wilderness waited, both beautiful and dangerous. But inside, surrounded by the combined strength of human compassion and wild instinct, 4 bears and their human protectors continued their extraordinary journey of survival and healing. Days melted into weeks as Bella's physical health gradually improved, but Jack and Rachel noticed subtle changes in her behavior. The once mighty grizzly spent long hours watching her cubs, her eyes holding a wisdom and urgency that tugged at their hearts. She seemed to understand something they didn't want to acknowledge. Her time was growing short. The bullet wound had healed, but the internal damage was more severe than they'd initially thought. Bella's body was failing her, not from infection now, but from the trauma she'd endured. Yet her determination to prepare her cubs for survival never wavered. One crisp morning, Jack witnessed a remarkable scene. Bella had managed to stand, swaying slightly but stable, and was demonstrating to her cubs how to forage. She pawed at the cabin's wooden floor, mimicking the motion of digging for roots and tubers. Zeus, Shadow, and Thor watched intently, their small heads tilted in concentration. "She's teaching them," Rachel whispered, not wanting to disturb the lesson. "Even now, she's making sure they learn everything they need to know." Jack nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "She knows," he said softly. "She knows she won't be with them much longer." The cubs had grown significantly under their mother's care. Zeus had developed into a confident young bear, already showing signs of the powerful adult he would become. Cooper had mastered his mother's careful movements, learning to move quietly despite his size. And Thor, though still the smallest, had developed a cleverness that often surprised them all. Bella's lessons became more frequent and urgent. She would demonstrate hunting techniques, showing her cubs how to use their sense of smell, how to move silently, how to identify potential threats. Even confined to the cabin, she found ways to teach them the skills they'd need in the wild. "Look at this," Rachel said one evening, reviewing footage she'd captured on her phone. The video showed Bella teaching her cubs how to fish, using a water bowl they'd provided. Her movements were precise, showing them exactly how to wait, how to strike. She's compressed years of lessons into weeks. It's extraordinary. Jack watched as Thor successfully scooped a floating apple piece from the bowl, mimicking his mother's technique perfectly. "They're learning," he said, "but are they learning enough?" The answer came sooner than any of them wanted. One cold morning, Bella didn't rise to greet the dawn as usual. Her breathing was shallow, her once bright eyes dulled with pain. The cubs sensed the change immediately. Zeus positioned himself protectively near her head, while Cooper pressed close to her side. Thor moved between his mother and the humans, as if trying to guard her from anything that might cause her more harm. Rachel examined Bella carefully, her experienced hands gentle but thorough. When she met Jack's eyes, they both knew. This was a day they'd been dreading. "The cubs," Jack started, but Rachel shook her head. "Let them stay with her," she said softly. "They need this time." Throughout the day, Bella continued teaching her final lessons. Though she could barely move, she would make soft sounds, teaching her cubs different vocalizations for warning, comfort, and danger. Each cub responded in turn, learning their mother's last instructions. As evening approached, Bella's breathing became more labored. The cubs grew increasingly distressed, making small whimpering sounds that broke Jack's heart. He and Rachel sat nearby, silent witnesses to this powerful moment between mother and cubs. Bella's final act was to gather her cubs close, nuzzling each one in turn. She spent extra time with Thor, as if ensuring her smallest cub had the strength he would need. Then, with one last look at Jack and Rachel, a look that seemed to hold both gratitude and a final plea to protect her babies, Bella closed her eyes for the last time. The cubs' reactions were immediate and heartbreaking. Zeus let out a low moan that seemed to carry all the grief his young heart could hold. Cooper pressed himself against his mother's still form, while Thor moved between his siblings, touching each one as if trying to comfort them. Jack and Rachel gave the cubs time to say goodbye, watching as they went through their own process of grief. Hours passed, and finally, exhausted from their sorrow, the cubs fell asleep, curled against their mother's body one last time. "We need to move her before they wake," Rachel said quietly, wiping tears from her eyes. "They need to understand." Jack nodded, understanding the cruel necessity. They had to help the cubs transition, help them move forward without their mother. As they carefully prepared to move Bella's body, Jack made a silent promise to her. Her cubs would survive, would grow strong, would live the life she had died protecting. The next morning, they buried Bella beneath a towering pine tree near the cabin. The cubs watched from the window as Jack and several volunteers dug through the frozen ground, their small faces pressed against the glass. When they brought the cubs out later to say a final goodbye, each one approached the grave differently. Zeus stood guard, his small frame somehow managing to look majestic as he watched over the site. Cooper gently pawed at the earth, making soft crying sounds that echoed through the forest. Thor, in a moment that brought fresh tears to everyone's eyes, placed a pine cone, one Bella had used in her lessons, on top of the grave. As they led the cubs back inside, Jack caught Rachel's eye. They both knew that while one chapter of this remarkable story had ended, another was just beginning. Bella's legacy would live on through her cubs and through the lessons she had taught not just them, but all who had witnessed her extraordinary final weeks of motherhood. Spring arrived in Montana, bringing with it new life and the bittersweet moment Jack and Rachel had been preparing for. The three cubs, now significantly larger and more capable, were ready for their final journey, the return to the wild. The past months had been filled with careful preparation, teaching the cubs everything they would need to know while honoring the foundation their mother had laid. Zeus had grown into his role as protector, his powerful frame and confidence bearing reminiscent of Bella. Shadow's quiet intelligence and careful movements made him a natural survivor, while Thor, though still the smallest, had developed an uncanny ability to solve problems that amazed even the wildlife experts. "The location's perfect," Rachel said, spreading a map across Jack's kitchen table. "It's deep and protected territory, far from hunting zones, good food sources, natural shelter, and most importantly, no other territorial bears in the immediate area." She pointed to a remote valley that Bella's tracking data had shown she'd frequented in the past. Jack watched through the window as the cubs practiced their foraging skills in the yard. Thor had just successfully dug up a root they'd buried, demonstrating the technique Bella had shown them months ago. They remember, he said softly, everything she taught them. They remember the rehabilitation process had been carefully planned. Over the past weeks, they'd gradually reduced human contact, ensuring the cubs maintained their natural wariness of people. They'd created increasingly complex food puzzles, teaching the cubs to work for their meals as they would in the wild. The three young bears had exceeded all expectations, their mother's early lessons providing a strong foundation for their training. The transport team will be here at dawn, Rachel reminded him, though she knew Jack hadn't forgotten. How could he? These cubs had changed everything for him, for the local wildlife community, and for the future of bear conservation in Montana. That evening, Jack sat in his familiar chair, watching the cubs for the last time in his cabin. Zeus was attempting to climb the stone fireplace, his powerful muscles rippling under his thick fur. Cooper had found a quiet corner to practice his stealth, moving with remarkable silence for a young bear. Thor, true to form, had managed to figure out how to open the special lock on their food container, earning proud looks from his brothers. "Your mama would be so proud," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The cubs paused their activities, looking at him with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the significance of the moment. Thor, in a gesture that brought tears to Jack's eyes, ambled over and placed his paw on Jack's knee, just as he had done as a tiny cub all those months ago. Dawn broke clear and cold, painting the Montana sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold. The transport team arrived with 3 specialized crates, each designed to carry a young bear safely into the wilderness. Loading the cubs was harder emotionally than physically. Each one seemed to understand that a major change was coming. The convoy of vehicles wound their way deep into the wilderness, following Forest Service roads until even those disappeared. The final miles would be on foot, ensuring the cubs would be released in truly wild territory. Jack and Rachel walked beside the crates, offering quiet words of encouragement to their charges. When they reached the chosen spot, a beautiful valley dotted with berry bushes and crossed by a clear stream, everyone fell silent. This was it, the moment of release. Jack approached each crate in turn, speaking softly to each cub one last time. "Zeus, protect your brothers, just like you always have." The largest cub huffed in response, his eyes fixed on the wilderness before him. "Shadow, stay clever and quiet. Your mama taught you well." The middle cub made a soft sound, already analyzing his new surroundings. Thor, Jack's voice caught as he reached the smallest cub's crate. "You keep surprising them all, little one. Show them what Bella's smallest cub can do." Rachel gave the signal, and the crates were opened simultaneously. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, deliberately, the cubs emerged. They stayed close together, Zeus taking the lead as always, Cooper watching their surroundings and Thor bringing up the rear, his small frame vibrating with nervous energy. The cubs paused at the edge of the clearing, turning to look back one last time. In that moment, Jack saw Bella in all of them, her strength, her wisdom, her incredible spirit. Zeus let out a soft grunt, and as if on signal, all 3 cubs melted into the wilderness, disappearing into their new home. The team waited until sunset, monitoring from a distance to ensure the cubs were adjusting well. They watched as the young bears explored their territory, already putting their learned skills to use. Thor discovered a honey-laden log, Zeus successfully caught a fish in the stream, and Cooper found them a sheltered place to rest. As the light faded, Jack and Rachel prepared to leave, their hearts full of both sadness and hope. "Bella's legacy lives on," Rachel said, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "These cubs will make her proud." Jack nodded, unable to speak. He took one last look at the valley where 3 orphaned cubs had become wild bears, carrying with them the lessons of their mother's love and the compassion of those who had helped them survive. The stars were just beginning to appear as they made their way back, and somewhere in the growing darkness, 3 young bears were starting their new life, carrying forward a story of survival, sacrifice, and the extraordinary bonds between all living creatures. If this story has touched your heart and you want to explore more touching tales of the bond between humans and animals, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more fascinating and inspiring videos. Thank you for watching, and we hope you will continue this journey with us in the next stories.